into the cloud. Hello, everybody. This is Eli Sagor. You're not looking at me. You see Marcella Windmuller-Campione, our presenter today. But I'm going to go ahead and get things started with today's webinar presentation. We've got a terrific turnout. Welcome to all of you who are joining either online or at a broadcast site, one of 7 or 8 sites around the state. I'm glad to have you with us. Today we're going to be hearing about how site influences regeneration after silvicultural treatments in black ash stands. Marcella is going to be addressing that topic for us. Next month, on Tuesday, March 17th, we've got another great one. I do think we've got a good series this year. Are you good, Marcella? Or is...
I am. I moved
okay,
my
great.
computer, sorry.
Ah, we're good. Mike Schrag is going to be talking about the status of elk restoration in Northeast Minnesota, again on Tuesday, March 17th. If you're tuning in the hope of obtaining, or if you're interested in obtaining continuing education credits for watching this presentation live, I will share a link to a form that you will need to fill out within an hour of the end of Marcella's presentation in order to obtain those credits, and we will report those. By the way, if you are wondering why some of those reports might have reached you a little more slowly, it's because we're short-staffed. I'm trying to do double duty, and so I apologize and appreciate your patience with all of that as we're in between staff members. Without any further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Marcella. She's an assistant professor in the University of Minnesota Department of Forest Resources. She's presenting today from 19 Green Hall. And as I said, she's going to be talking about regeneration after silvicultural treatments in black ash stands. And with that, Marcella, you're on.
Great. Thank you, Eli. Is feedback okay? So I'm really excited to be here. This is some work that myself, Matt Russell, Rob Slezak, and Matt Lochner have been working on and are putting together for publication.
Marcella, I'm going to interrupt for just a minute. So your mic is muted, but you need to mute your computer so the sound doesn't come out here.
Okay. Okay, computer is muted. Is that better?
Yep, so your computer should not be sending out any audio. Are you still hearing it?
I don't think so.
I think it is, isn't it?
Feedback, yeah. So I pressed that.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Okay, we're going to do this differently. Yep, so you'll just present using your mic.
Okay, perfect.
And that should work. I'm sorry about that.
No worries. As long as everyone can hear, that's good. And everyone can see okay? Okay, perfect. Great. Well, let's get into it. So as I was saying, some work with Matt Russell, Rob, and Matt Lochner, looking at the differences of silvicultural systems, so different harvesting in black ash stands, after harvest. So let's get right into some main takeaways. So like the title suggests, site matters. So better quality sites may be suited for clear-cut harvesting. So that's really going to be one of the big messages, is knowing your site and knowing what type of black ash, how high of a quality black ash stand you have. So a better site, so those that are have some kind of mesic hardwood component, have better drainage, those might be best suited or better suited for a clear cut. And after that clear cut harvesting, what we're seeing with that regeneration, that small pull, those kind of your future forests, we are seeing a lot of different species coming in, but really importantly, a big component of that future forest were these populus. So big-tooth aspen, trembling aspen, and poplar, balsam poplar were coming in after harvesting, potentially not only increasing site quality and site diversity, but also adding that resilience to future EAB outbreaks.
Marcella,
yeah,
you need to share your screen again. That's my mistake. That happened when we readjusted the mic.
Okay, so
share screen, and green down at the bottom. There you go.
Okay, let's try that. Share. Okay. Are people seeing?
Yeah, we're seeing the presenter view again. You remember
Okay.
what you did last time?
I think so. Let's see. Where was that at?
You could,
Hold on.
there you go. Oh, we had it for a moment.
Let me share. Just this time. Okay. We will get started, I promise.
Yes. Thanks everyone for bearing with us. This shouldn't take too long.
Okay, is that?
I think this is going to work.
Is that better? Okay.
Yes.
So getting back, main takeaways. So site matters, higher quality sites, you're going to get different suite of species, especially those aspen species coming in, and that can lead to increased resilience if and more likely when EAB hits some of these northern forests. One of the big pieces that we found was depth to muck, and we'll talk about what muck is, can help determine site quality. Black ash regenerates well after all types of harvest. That's really repeating and kind of confirming and what has been known, what has been seen on a lot of these different study sites that we're kind of building for this management of black ash. And we also found a really interesting piece of there was no relationship between the amount of overstory residuals and regeneration. So let's get into a quick EAB review. It's a beautiful, beautiful, large green beetle that is native to Asia and attacks ash trees with almost 100% mortality down to 1 inch in diameter. So, and it's caused millions and millions of dollars in damage and also has killed millions of trees already. So EAB life cycle, like many other beetles, they bore into the wood and have that characteristic kind of D-shaped exit hole. They're, and really, sorry, I'm moving through this just because I want to make sure we have enough time to get through that. But EAB life cycle, distribution and range, and this is really kind of interesting, is 2002, found in Detroit. A big note is that EAB will only move about a half mile to a mile a year if left untouched. However, it moved from Detroit in 2009. It was found in Minneapolis, and 2016 we have it in Duluth. And obviously, it's not just moving by itself, as you see this extensive kind of distribution of people being really big mediators of this movement of EAB. So again, a reminder, please don't move firewood. Please don't move any kind of material, because EAB has really made its way across most of the eastern part of North America. So a big question that comes up with EAB and the life cycle is, what about the cold, especially in Minnesota? So Matt Russell was very generous to share this slide. So EAB overwinters beneath the bark, but cannot survive excessive cold. So we have these kind of survival numbers of 50% of EAB die at -20, 90% die at -30. This is, of course, from last year with that really, really cold snap. So winter temperatures can help kind of mediate some of that population buildup. So, however, in addition to this, it's not just the outside temperature. So you also have to consider the temperature, the tree location, bark thickness, snow depth. So there's a lot of other pieces that can kind of play into what that actual temperature is that the beetle is being impacted by. But if we do keep having these cold snaps, there is some potential for that mediation. So let's talk about ash in Minnesota. So we have 3 species of ash. We have black ash, green ash, and white ash. And this is one of the pockets of green ash that's already been hit by EAB in one of the St. Paul Parks metro area. So this is Crosby Farm, for those of you that are familiar with, and that is almost 95% of ash in the overstory, with some few cottonwoods along the upper Mississippi River. And almost all that ash has already succumbed to a mortality from EAB. So looking at our species, so we have white ash common in our mesic forest, and it's often found in these kind of mixed hardwood forests. Black ash, which I'll spend the majority of our time talking about today, big piece of our forest in Minnesota. 90 million trees greater than 1 inch side in Minnesota. And the big thing, especially with black ash, is that black ash often occurs in these very unique settings of wetlands, poorly drained soils, and it's often these systems are black ash dominant. So there are very few other overstory species. And then green ash, which is common on upland sites or along floodplains, is also, but we're going to spend the majority of our time talking about black ash. And before we move into the silvicultural systems, I do want to mention another piece of this broader project was looking at developing statewide estimates of ash in Minnesota. So Trevor Host worked with the forest inventory data from the DNR, so the FIM training, and developed this set of information and training polygons to look at how, and did look at how to predict black ash presence and absence across Minnesota. So this is for all 3 species, and using this kind of 30-meter resolution. So this is looking at presence, absence, with ash of all species across Minnesota. We really focused on some of this black ash with the unique phenology, as well as some of the location, so the physiographic location, so those wetlands and those poorly drained sites. So that paper should be coming out soon, hopefully, as we kind of finish that up. But let myself, Rob, or Matt know if you would like any of that information, and we can get that passed along to you. So why we care about ash in Minnesota. So I already kind of mentioned some of these stats, but as of 2017, we have 218 million ash trees larger than 10 inches DBH. So I am going to talk in metric. I'll try to add some conversions in there, but that's 8.4% of all forest land in the state. Ash is present at least 50% of the total live tree value on a huge amount of forest land, and it ranks 5th as the most common tree. So we're talking about a huge component of our forest. Black ash is composed mainly of black ash, very dominant. And so those stands that are impacted by EAB will be highly impacted. Unlike other places that are more commonly dominated by green ash or white ash that are composed of kind of these mixed hardwood stands that may have a lesser amount of that ash component, where other species may be able to still be there. Black ash is pretty much a black ash forest. And EAB is rated as the biggest forest health concern by managers in that 2017 survey. So let's get talking about black ash. So without EAB, we probably would not be having this webinar on black ash management. So there's this classic kind of managing black ash from the Forest Service, North Central Research Station. And I think it's a really interesting topic from 1987. So over 30 years ago, it was discussing black ash management, and often it brought these major problems. And these are still problems. So black ash grows slowly on organic peats and mucks. They don't grow very hard. Black ash seedling saplings and sprout tend to dominate the regeneration, where partial openings in the canopy have occurred. Clear cutting on organic sites often results in inadequate natural regeneration or a loss of advanced regeneration to rising water tables. So this was not new information, but the big thing is, previously, when we were thinking about managing black ash stands, we were thinking about managing black ash to get ash regeneration. That's no longer the case when we're thinking about managing ash stands, especially black ash in the face of EAB. Remember, EAB will impact ash down to 1 inch in diameter. So that regeneration that you're getting from black ash is susceptible at 1 inch. So this has led to a lot of recent work looking at options for these black ash stands in the face of EAB. And so I'll touch a little bit on the Chippewa black ash study with Tony D'Amato, Brian Palick, and Rob Slezak, and kind of just have some of that information, because that has been a really, really valuable study that has produced a lot of information on thinking about how different types of harvest scenarios can play out in black ash stands. What are those trade-offs? What are those impacts? The Silvicultural Library, of course, has had many contributors, and it's going to take all this information. Of course, Minnesota and Wisconsin DNR have added additional guidelines and silvicultural recommendations. So it's going to take all these pieces to put together to really kind of start playing around with how are we going to manage this huge acreage of black ash if and when EAB moves into our northern forest. So Chippewa black ash study, this is located on the Chippewa National Forest. Different treatments, including the group selection, a control, a clear cut, and really a big piece is these are black ash dominant sites. They had a perched water table, and these were these lower quality black ash stands. So the girdle, I forgot the girdle treatment. So to emulate the EAB clear cut, the group selection, harvest, and the control. And these were established in the winter of 2011 and 2012. And so they're producing a lot of information and have received some more funding to keep this going. There's a lot of investigators on this. And so I'll have some of those citations in here, but please feel free. I can pass along anything else if there's interest. So some of the things that are unsurprising, right? A clear-cut treatment on these poor sites cause changes in the water level, and that clear-cut caused swamping out. We see less of that, especially in the group selection and the girdling. We didn't have that initially, but I think they're seeing some changes in the future. When they planted these species, they planted a ton of different species, but overall there was generally pretty low survival. So we're looking at a total of about 30 to 35% overall survival across all of these species. So there are some standouts, including the Manchurian ash and swamp white oak. So there are some standouts that had higher survival. But those individuals that had that higher survival generally had lower growth. And those individuals with higher growth were ones with lower survival. So there is this trade-off that was happening in the species that were selected. So this gives a base that there's information being gathered. There's no one silver bullet. So there's no one species we're going to be able to replace in our black ash stands. And we're also not going to be able to plant all these black ash stands with artificial regeneration. So let's think about what can we do on some of our other stands? What about natural regeneration? So from that same document, on slightly better drain site, tree species are more abundant and diverse. Here are species more demanding in their site requirements, such as white ash, green ash, basswood, yellow birch, red maple, and even sugar maple occur along with black ash. So what other options do we have? And while white ash and green ash are still going to be losers with EAB, what about these other species? So the goal of our study was to assess natural regeneration dynamics in black ash forests across 3 silvicultural systems. So we had a clear-cut, group selection, and diameter limit harvesting. And I'm going to really note, like, diameter limiting harvesting, we're going to come back to that as whether this is a silvicultural system or not. So we're going to put a note on that. So the objectives were to quantify structure, composition, and diversity of regeneration, and assess differences between richer and poorer sites treated with clear cutting. So the study area, again, thank you to all the organizations who supplied stands for the study. We could not do this without you. So we had 16 stands. These were harvested between 2007 and 2013. And it was a black ash dominant stands that were harvested. So these are black ash stands. And these were all part of organizations' normal forest management. So these were not part of the study. We had no idea we were going to use it, but we wanted to look retrospectively at this. And with the clear cut, we were able to have enough information to be able to group these into richer sites. So generally those that had some kind of definition of a mesic hardwood. So there's some, either the ecological classification, the ECS was noted as MN or MHN, or there was something that led us to believe that there was a richer site there, or poorer sites that were part of that wet forest system. These were sampled in the summer of 2018. So some sampling design logistics. So this again is a retrospective analysis. So these stands were harvested. They were part of general normal operations for each individual land management organization. We came in during the winter of 2018 and asked organizations if they had any black ash stands and could supply us information for stands that were harvested during a longer time period. So there is no experimental control either. So there is no non-harvested black ash stands in this study. The group selection, we characterize this as group. So that gap and as the matrix, we separated those during our analysis. And so some of the limitations with our data, so a lot of our sites don't have ECS data for it. So I'll touch on why that might be, but setting up harvest in these black ash stands often occur during the winter. And I'll show some pictures of the students that were out there during the summer, and it was just a little buggy, and there was just a few things that they had to contend with. And so a lot of this, we don't know exactly what that ECS data is. And there was also variability in that gap size in the group selection. So, so what did we do? So we did general forest inventory. And so plot variables, we looked at landscape position, depth to muck, and presence of water on the site. Overstory, we measured trees greater than 1 inch in diameter. So yep, that was a lot of trees on some of these sites that these students measured. So we looked at species, status, whether they were live or dead, diameter, height on the subset of these, as well as crown position and percent canopy cover. And then we also did a smaller plot for regeneration for trees less than 1 inch, as well as species, status, and height class, and some general understory composition. So percent composition by these kind of major classes. So like forbs, grasses, shrubs, those kind of pieces. So let's touch on that, depth to muck for a second. So what is muck? So here is the USDA NRCS definition as a sapric soil that are saturated more than 30 cumulative days in a normal year. So soils made up of primarily of humus from drained swamplands. I think if you worked in these forests, you kind of know muck and kind of have that feel for what these soils look like that are poorly drained. And extremely fun to work in and cross as. So before I start getting into more of the results and a little bit of that, I want to make sure there's time for any questions if some have come up, Eli.
Yep. We have not received any questions yet. I would invite folks to submit questions anytime. You can do it quickly now if you would like to. Marcella may pause one more time, or I'm not sure when you're planning to. Maybe.
No, I think I'll go through.
Great.
Yeah. So
from here, she's going to go to the end. So go ahead and post those questions anytime. Somebody asked earlier on the chat, should they post them to the Q&A pod or the chat pod? And I replied chat. Either one of those is just fine. You can use Q&A or chat. But not seeing any questions now, Marcella, I would invite you to continue.
oh, there's one in the room, Eli.
Oh, I'm sorry. I should have turned around.
Did you say that in that study of the two-part forest, that girdling, initially there wasn't swamping, but that now it's showing up?
So I think, let me make sure and check with Rob. I think they're still working on some of that data. So a lot of those black ash are still standing in that girdled stand. So I can check with him on the most recent kind of what they're finding from that. But some of those initial measurements were showing that clear cut was really different than some of the other treatments.
Still no questions online, Marcella, and I don't see any more in here, so you're good to go.
Okay, so post-harvest black ash stands. So those can be super fun sites to visit. And so I just want to give you a little bit of a view. So this is one of the richer sites that we visited, and was the first site we visited to kind of test out the sampling design. And so on a clear-cut rich site, you're looking at a pretty good wall of vegetation that has come in after harvest, compared to maybe on those poorer sites, which is another example. So crews would see the clear-cut rich site on their schedule for the week and know they were going to spend a whole lot of time with calipers measuring everything over an inch. And then on the clear-cut poor sites, knew that they should make sure their waders were in the car because they were going to probably be tromping through some wetter conditions, but measuring a lot less trees. And then this is looking from within a gap of a group selection. So you can see there's some scattered trees kind of coming in, but we still have that overstory vegetation. So I'm gonna walk through some of this data, and it is in metric, and so wanted to make sure I didn't make any mistakes transposing as we're getting ready for publication. So let's talk about some treatment summaries. So first off, when we're looking at all species that are regenerating under an inch in diameter, we're getting a ton of regeneration across all the different harvest types. So we're seeing high regeneration, but also there's some high variability, especially if we're looking at that clear cut rich with the standard deviation here. So high regeneration, but also high variability. And if we look at how that regeneration is kind of split up by species, so we have percent regeneration over here, and some of the common species that we found. So some of the first things is that black ash is a dominant component of this regeneration layer. So anywhere from about between 20 and 40%, we're seeing that of that regeneration is dominated by black ash. So black ash is not going anywhere. But we also see some of these other species coming in that are alder, hazel, dogwood at various levels. But again, high variability. So those error bars are pretty large. And then if we look at our regeneration of our aspen species, we see with the exception of the group matrix, we're getting aspen coming in across all of these different systems. So, and we wouldn't expect necessarily aspen to be coming in a place that hasn't been harvested in the matrix of a group selection. So let's start looking at that overstory structure and density. So again, overstory, we're defining this as everything over an inch in diameter. So probably not surprising when we look at the group selection in the matrix, as well as the diameter limiting harvest. So those harvest that left trees over X inches, or remove trees over X inches, sorry, diameter limit harvest, remove trees over X inches, we see that those had larger diameter trees on average compared to the clear cut and within the group selection. We also see that in the amount of live basal area as well. So there is those significant differences between, say, a diameter limit harvest and a group selection compared to the clear cut and the group selection gaps. What we didn't find differences was in the live overstory trees per acre. So high variability in the number of trees coming in. We also found no relationship between overstory density and regeneration. So no significant regeneration, which means that you may have some flexibility in the amount of residuals you leave, also how you disperse those residuals. That is not likely going to impact the amount of regeneration you have. So this has been found over and over again. Black ash is a component after all harvest types in all the different layers of vegetation. So that percent may vary a little, but we're still seeing that black ash is a significant component in both the clear cut treatments as well as the diameter limit harvesting and group selection. It's a little lower in the group selection gaps in terms of the overstory BA. But that regeneration, again, around that 20 to about 40% with high variability. So if we focus in on these trees that are about an inch to 5 inches in diameter, so those well-established saplings and poles, so this is your future forest. So what is this future forest going to look at? And we have, again, the same color scheme. Our black is clear-cut poor, the lighter is clear-cut rich, this kind of light gray diameter limit, and then we move into the group selections with the gap and the white with the matrix. And we see the stories start to emerge of what our future forest is going to look like. And this is an interesting component of looking at how the clear-cut poor and looking at the clear-cut rich, this amount of regeneration. One, you're just getting more regeneration, and we saw that with the overall number. So there's regeneration, and it's not significantly different, but there's just a lot of regeneration happening in that clear-cut rich site, which is not necessarily unsurprising. A richer site, there's opportunity for that regeneration. But there is a lot of regeneration on that clear-cut rich site happening in these populous species. So again, big tooth aspen, trembling aspen, and balsam poplar. So there's a lot of regeneration that's coming in after a clear cut on a rich site. We see that you're still going to have black ash, and you're getting these other species coming in, but there's a real potential opportunity on these richer sites. We see alder and these other hardwoods, very few conifers coming in. So looking at that relationship with vegetation, are there pieces that we can kind of look at? So ECS, or that ecological classification system, can tell us about that information on the site richness. Are there other variables we can also look at in terms of the relationship to the vegetation? So our students measured the depth to the muck, and we looked at that relationship, and we found significant relationships and opposite relationships when we looked at those two species. So looking at black ash, we saw as you increase that depth to muck, you saw an increase in the percent of black ash in that 1 to 5 inch diameter class. So you see an increasing relationship. So as your sites gets muckier, you're going to have an increased amount of black ash, percent of black ash regeneration making up that. As your sites get less mucky, so as you get slightly less mucky, so a slightly more well-drained site, you're more likely to have these aspen species coming in. So it's kind of a nice relationship here between these two species, and especially in thinking about what we want to regenerate and thinking about that resilience to EAB. And this is an ordination. So again, kind of painting this picture of that these sites are different. And so an ordination looks at these characteristics in ordination space. And the big takeaway is to notice the differences. And so our clear-cut rich is in this white color. We have group selection as in the gap, as well as the clear-cut pore. And then we have the diameter limit and the group selection matrix. So we see those that have a higher retention of residuals, those are more similar. So we saw that in the overstory structure and composition component. So there's just more similarities in these species when you're leaving those larger diameter trees. That's what we would expect. We see the clear-cut rich is really kind of by itself. It's a very different community that's coming in, compared to, say, even the gaps of the group selection, as well as the clear-cut pore. So those are grouping together. So we're seeing these different opportunities or different communities developing after harvest types. So let's talk about what this means. So summarizing the data, thinking about what this means. So site matters when considering the type of harvest. This matters no matter whether you're working in black ash, whether you're working in hardwoods, whether you're working in pine. The site matters, and that's no different when we're thinking about black ash. So clear cutting on a richer site, so mesic hardwood inclusion, can result in these regeneration of non-black ash species. And that was documented in the Black Ash Management, or the Ash Management Guidelines from 1987 by IRMED. So this is not new information. It's just thinking about on a site that can support these other species, you might be able to clear cut, and that might be a really effective tool. So on those sites, there was thousands of stems over 1 inch in diameter. And those students spent a little bit of time measuring all those stems on 1/10 acre plots. So we have that documentation. So muck can provide a lot of information on site quality. So we measured muck by sticking a piece of rebar into the ground to kind of get a feel for how that soil was feeling. So not all these sites, many of our sites that we chose for our study, there was not information on the plant communities. And I don't necessarily blame them for trying to think about getting good ECS data in a black ash stand in the middle of the summer. So while there's all these acres of black ash, some of these sites have that ECS data, some of them do not. But as you're thinking about what sites a treatment may be best suited for, something like looking at that muck layer, looking at what the site quality is through the soils compared to the ECS classification may be an easier sell for someone, a field tech, a student, an undergraduate student, a forester. You get to keep walking with that rebar across the site compared to potentially that look of getting all those unique plants that are there in a black ash stand. So we saw no relationship between overstory residuals and regeneration. So this means that there's flexibility in the amount of leaf trees. So the amount, so the total basal area, the total trees per acre, so where you put them, how you put them, and also what those leaf trees are being used for. Those can provide seed. Those can also influence the hydrology. So what we saw on these sites was there is no impact, no relationship between the overstory residuals and your regeneration. So that gives managers flexibility, even more flexibility in thinking about the site, in designing the site to meet potentially the objectives and goals that you have for that. Okay, so I think most people who work in black ash have seen this. This is the same thing on the Chippewa. This is the same thing with many of the case studies on the Silvicultural library. Black ash regenerates really, really well after all types of harvest. And this species is really just well suited for this type of system. And it's adapted to these sites. It's going to be a component of the system. It will be really interesting to look at how these systems then respond with EAB. But it's regenerating well, and no harvest that you do is going to remove that from your site. Group selection seem to be a very good fit on these poor or wet forest sites. So it regenerates. However, there are some limitations. So in a group selection, you're regenerating only a portion of the stand. That Chippewa study, 20% was removed. So that's just a portion. And that also may require multiple entries if you're thinking about the regeneration of the whole stand. But there can be some flexibility in that gap size and the surrounding matrix. Again, the residuals, the regeneration. So again, thinking about this longer term, thinking about the site, thinking about the quality, and thinking about what the goals are. Diameter limit. So I'm coming back to this. So diameter limit harvesting was proposed as this phloem reduction. So if you reduce that overstory wood, the phloem, the food source for the beetle, can you reduce the impact from EAB? If you need to reduce the phloem down to under 1 inch in diameter, that's a clear cut. So, but if you're doing a diameter limit harvest and removing every tree above 8 inches or 5 inches, you're still having plenty of trees that are still viable source for EAB. You're also might be removing your best and leaving the rest or high grading. This is not one of those silvicultural systems. This was proposed, and especially during that early outbreak, as a way that if we reduce the phloem by using these diameter limit harvesting, maybe that can slow the spread, or maybe that's a treatment for EAB. Not the case. 1 inch in diameter, so you're still producing, you're still having that site be there. So some main takeaways, and I think I'm actually staying on time too. So site matters. So just in any silvicultural system, the site matters. So with this kind of large scale study that we kind of moved across the state, we saw that site really matters. On those better quality sites, you could potentially use a clear-cut harvest. We saw adequate regeneration, not only of black ash, but of these other species, especially aspen species coming in. And that might increase not only you're getting your regeneration, but you're also potentially increasing that resilience. So you're having a species that's not ash on your site. It's a coppice species. It regenerates sexually as well as asexually. So there's a potential future for that. It's also done through natural regeneration. So you're not paying to artificially regenerate that site. Depth to muck can help determine site quality. So that was a really easy tool that had the significant relationship. So increasing depth, so muckier site, we saw a higher percentage of those black ash individuals between 1 and 5 inches in diameter. Richer site or better drained site with less muck, we saw increasing percentage of these aspen or populus species. Black ash regenerates well after all types of harvest. So it's not going away. And we saw no relationship between the amount of overstory residuals and our regeneration. So again, I do want to have lots of gratitude to all the organizations that provided these sites, provided information, allowed us the opportunity to sample these stands. Lots of field assistance from Grace, Stitch, Trevor Host, and Brian Anderson. black ash stands are not the easiest to get to. They are also not necessarily the most enjoyable location to spend all summer sampling in. So extremely grateful to them, as well as our funding source. And with that, we've stayed on time. So I think there's a good amount of time for questions.
And we've got several. I'm going to start with an easy one, kind of going backwards.
Yeah.
Explain how to use the rebar gauge to gauge depth to muck, and what is a good number of centimeters in depth to muck to differentiate between rich and poor sites?
Okay, so I'm gonna pull that up again. So I'm not gonna remove that, but so that's a great question. So the depth to muck was literally them walking around with a rebar and sticking it in the ground and seeing how far they could get it to go down. So a muckier site has that really kind of nice soft soil, that muck that you can kind of stick the rebar down, compared to a harder soil. I'm gonna have to potentially get back to you on what a good depth to muck to consider. That's like, we hadn't really thought about what that cutoff is, or what that looks like. That's a great question. If you can email me, whoever that was,
Sure.
or I guess I can provide that follow-up information to Eli, that could be posted
Sure.
or somehow.
Yeah, we can do that.
But that's a great question. But it does seem like you're looking at, so you have that range and variability, but it seems like once you get past maybe that, especially that 75 centimeters, you start to scale down, but you get some pretty high regeneration numbers in that 0 to 50. And also that seems to be where you kind of get some of these lower numbers or percentages with that black ash component. So you really start to scale up once you get farther down in that depth.
Great. I think, Marcella, from the timing this question came in, it might be a slide or two before this. What was the site poor versus rich distribution? So what was the site distribution in terms of poor versus rich for the 3 treatments without a site indicator on the label? And I'm not certain which slide that was, but like I said, I think it might have been
So
maybe the person who posted that. Yeah, maybe it was that series of figures.
So maybe the map, is that what we're looking at maybe?
They followed up that, well, no, I guess that's a different question.
So we tried to have this as spatially unbiased and a broad scale sampling as we could. We really were limiting. If you think back to 2007 to 2013, that's still when EAB was relatively new. There was some hope that maybe it would be contained, maybe it wouldn't make it to Minnesota. There still wasn't that much black ash being managed in Minnesota. So from those organizations that sent stuff, we had only so much to choose from.
Yeah. So the questioner further explained, poor versus rich was referring to all of the graphs of species distribution by treatment type.
Species distribution by treatment type.
So I'm guessing
So is that
maybe those.
okay?
Clear cut poor, clear cut rich.
Diameter limit harvest. Yep. And what was the question again, Eli?
Good question. I lost it. What was the site distribution in terms of poor versus rich for the 3 treatments without site indicator on the label? Okay, I see. So you have clear cut poor and clear cut rich. Those specify poor versus rich. What about diameter limit harvest, group selection gap, and group selection matrix?
So those were ones that we didn't have that information on the ECS type or enough information to be able to have them grouped into a richer or poorer site. And so we use that information from the Chippewa study where the group selection had a lower kind of change in that water table level. So we were hoping that we would be able to, not having that information, we were hoping we were able to make some, we were able to group those better than, say, a clear-cut site. Is that answering that person?
We'll let them follow up, and we do have a number of other questions.
Okay.
So one of these, I think your explanation after this question came in may have clarified, but a couple of people asked, the access label says depth of muck, but it must have been at one point you said depth to muck. The way you explained the rebar is depth of muck.
Yep, depth of, depth of muck. Yep, sorry.
Great, and I think that takes care of the second half of that question. That's no longer relevant. Okay, can you describe the diameter limit treatment, and also what was your plot size? Diameter limit, I think you said 12.7 centimeters, which is 5 inches. Is that correct?
So there was a few different types of diameter limit harvesting. So there was 2 kind of upper diameter limits. So one was 5 inches. There's also an 8-inch, and I believe there's also a 10-inch diameter limit harvesting. So there was various levels of overstory removal that was grouped together as a diameter limit harvesting. So the big difference between a diameter limit harvest and the group selection was the group selection did implement gaps. So these were very visible gaps that we could locate, and we could sample within the gap compared to the matrix, where the diameter limit was removing all trees over X amount. We used approximately 1/10 acre plots to perform all of this sampling.
Great. When gauging site quality, is site index of any value?
So some of the sites had site index, some of the sites did not have site index. So that wasn't something that we could also rely on to be able to gauge that. And so we weren't able just to use that.
All right. How did the populus species regenerate? In our area, balsam poplar grows on wetter sites more than the other species. Is there any data that separates out which of the populus species were most dominant?
We could pull out that data if that was of interest. The goal really was getting something that was non-ash to regenerate. So, and that was really coming back as the species that we could group together. And I was really, really surprised by the amount of the diversity of species that we saw. So I think there was almost 15 to 20 different overstory species observed across these 16 different sites. So we grouped them together, but I can definitely start to pull out that information if that's of interest.
This is another one that I'm not sure which slide it refers to, but what does hardwood include in the regeneration table?
Yeah, so those were, I can forward that along to you, but those were all the species that weren't, all the hardwood species that weren't the ones presented here. So we saw swamp white oak, there was yellow birch, there was paper birch, there was white ash, green ash. There was just this whole suite of different species that came in. And likewise, kind of with the conifer species, we saw, again, I'm using this colloquial we, I saw one site. The undergrads saw spruce, balsam fir, both black spruce and white spruce, balsam fir, eastern white pine. I think there might have been a random jack pine or two around there. So there's just a huge diversity of species in this lower amounts that were coming in.
Great. Well, I think you addressed that. The question is, was American elm grouped in with the hardwoods? Sounds like it was a kind of a catch-all.
Yep, so if American elm was present, it would have been grouped in with the hardwood. So there wasn't enough of it as a species on its own to kind of pull out.
Marcelo, there was one that I answered in the chat. The question is, can you repeat what was the purpose of girdling black ash? This is a reference to the Chippewa. Was it EAB related or silvicultural purpose? I put in that I think it was to emulate EAB infestation.
Yep. So that kind of slow mortality and that slow death. So what these stands would look like, and especially that pretty much 100% girdling and that loss. So I think they're doing some really, really interesting work. And there's some new collaborations going on with wildlife folks, including Alexis Grindy, on what those stands look like, how they're serving different wildlife populations. And I believe they're also kind of just seeing how long these trees will stand in a black ash stand after they're dead.
Okay, I've got one more question here, but I will draw your attention, those of you online, to the chat pod where I have now posted the link where you can request continuing education credits. Please go ahead and do that right away so that we can get those processed. And also any feedback on the webinar, as always, we're interested in hearing from you. The last question I have here, Marcella, unless any others come in, would an NPC of WFN 55 be considered poor or rich?
Well, I'm going to leave that up to the person that's probably managing that site. So for the sites to be classified as a richer site, there had to be that mesic hardwood inclusion. So we use that as our cutoff for a richer or poorer site. But that's not to say that a wet forest could have the site qualities that you're looking for to potentially do something like a clear cut on it. So it really, really comes down to knowing your site, and especially what that site looks like, how that topography and how those underlying soils are across the site. That's really important. And I guess that brings up an important point of walking the site in maybe non-frozen conditions can tell you a lot. So I think there's still a whole lot of research that can be done, especially on some of those more borderline cases, or what exactly is a richer site. So this was just one summer of sampling across 16 stands. The Chippewa is one location that has this growing body of long-term information. So if that person does do something on that site, put it on the silviculture library. The more we can kind of gather about this information, the more we'll be able to understand what is that range of response. So are there certain environmental conditions that allow better regeneration of non-black ash species? There's just a whole host of questions on this forest type that we're still figuring out.
All right, thanks everyone. Oh, one just came in. We'll make this our last question. It's 12:59. Is there any indication that the regenerating tree species provide the same hydrologic functions as black ash?
So that I'm going to need to pass off to Rob Slezak and others, because that is not my expertise there.
Probably not the same, but at least there's something there growing and occupying the site.
Yeah.
I guess.
And I think, so as a non-hydrologist, I think there's probably promise, especially in those species that can regenerate asexually. So the ability for aspen to have that coppice system and that root system maintained, and that ability to potentially spread also through a coppice harvest, it seems like a very promising thing when we think about hydrology. But that is the big piece, especially on those porous sites, is that hydrological effect. And so from our data, we saw that those overstory, that residuals that you're leaving, that's not the amount, has no relationship to regeneration. So that would be one way I would point that person that asked that question. But again, still lots and lots more to investigate with this system.
All right, well, Marcella, thank you very much. That was a terrific presentation. Thanks to all of you who joined us online. Look for those continuing education and feedback links right in the chat pod. Really glad to have you all here, and I will post the recording shortly as soon as I get to it, probably within a few days. And I also invite you all to join us about a month from now to hear Mike Schrag with Fond du Lac Resource Management Division talking about the status of elk restoration in northeast Minnesota. Thanks, Marcella, and bye for now.
Thank you.